This week on Commercial Real Estate Secrets, we are talking how to raise money for your next commercial real estate deal, how to invest in commercial real estate passively on the other end, and how to use a podcast successfully to help get you there. Enjoy the episode. This week's listener of the week is A. Woods CRE. A. Woods, thank you for leaving us a 5-star review. And for those of you listening, if you leave us a 5-star review below, you might be next week's listener of the week. This week on Commercial Real Estate Secrets, we have Trevor Oldham. Trevor is the founder of Podcasting You. Trevor, thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you. Super excited to be here and hopefully provide some value to your listeners.
I have no doubt you will. Trevor, do me a favor. Can you tell the listeners who you are and what you do and how we got here today?
Yeah, most certainly. So just to give a high level overview, when I say that, because it's been about a 9 or 10 year journey. I mean, I could probably take a whole day talking about how I got from where I started to where I am. Long story short, it was back in 2015. I was running a different company than I run now. I had started my own podcast way before podcasting was popular, and I was the one that was recording or interviewing guests. I was editing the show. I was doing the show notes. I was doing the social media clips. I was bootstrapping the company with a partner, and we didn't have any money. So did that for about 2 years. Again, wasn't making any money and just wanted to start making money, obviously, because when you're doing 40-hour weeks on the side business, and I was still in college at the time, still going to college, it was a lot going on. So I just started freelancing myself out there, and I used Upwork. Upwork is a great freelancing platform, and I would basically find gigs of people that wanted to go on podcasts, people that needed help finding guests, people that needed help editing their show, basically everything that I'd self-taught myself. And then that really just grew over time, where it was on my own, to then first year bringing on the first employee, to growing over time to bringing on a few additional employees. And then nowadays what we do is we specialize working with folks in the real estate investment space, which has been really enjoyable. And early on, we would work with any client, and then specializing in real estate, but learning just because we're in real estate doesn't mean that it's a small niche. There's so many facets. There's so many different industries. I mean, if you're just talking asset classes to all the different types of tax professionals and CPAs and attorneys, it's a big niche within itself. And then I would say on top of that, because of that, just being around all these investors, I'm a passive investor in 4 different deals across a couple of different asset classes. So I like to also invest in real estate. I mean, when you're talking to investors all day long and working with them, you kind of get that bug, realizing I don't want to be active. I'd much rather be passive. I don't want to deal with tenants or anything like that. I'd rather write you a check for $50K and you deal with all of that, and I get, I still get a nice return on the back end. So in short, that's really what 9 or 10 years of my life has looked like.
Well, given you're on a commercial real estate podcast, seems like we're in the right space.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about the synergy that you have found between podcasting and commercial or just real estate investing in general.
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing that I found is people like going on the podcast more often than not to raise capital for their deals, because you get a lot of folks that are trying to meet your accredited investors. So you could think your doctors, your lawyers, your dentists, high income earners. Typically, when someone is listening to a podcast, they're going to be more educated, earn higher income. Not to say that everyone, hopefully people that are listening to podcasts are well educated, but more often than not, it's almost like folks that read books typically might be a little bit smarter than those who don't read books. It just makes sense at the end of the day. So I found that a lot of folks, especially in 2020, is when the business really started to take off, and there was a lot of new syndicators, there was a lot of new operators coming into the space, and they had these deals, but they're like, how can I promote these deals? And that's just, my company just happened to, we happened to be in business 3 years at that time and sort of caught fire. But I find that's more often than not where that synergy is you have the folks in the commercial real estate space that are raising capital, that have these deals, that are trying to promote themselves, but aren't sure how to promote themselves. And it's crazy because working with a lot of these investors, they're super good at what they do. They know how to underwrite deals. They know how to find deals. But when it comes to the raising capital side of it, that's one of the hardest aspects of, you could find a $10 million apartment complex and buy it for $5 million and have to raise $1 million for it. but raising that million might be very challenging if you don't know how to promote yourself. And not to say podcasting is the only way to promote yourself. Obviously, you want to do other forms of marketing like running ads and different things like that. But we sort of found ourselves a small little niche within the real estate community and find that commercial real estate really works with it. Because I mean, if we're talking like fix and flip, it might be a little bit more difficult. Where if you're a wholesaler, at the end of the day, what could you be promoting unless you're a coach or you have a course? Where if you're in commercial real estate, usually your deals are going to be a little bit bigger. And then because of that, you are typically raising capital. Not all the time, but a lot of the folks in commercial real estate we find are raising capital. And that's sort of the bread and butter that we found.
So, for somebody who doesn't know what an accredited investor is, can you explain accredited investor to a fifth grader?
Yeah, most certainly. So basically, an accredited investor is someone that earns $200,000 per year for, I believe, at least 2 consecutive years, or you earn $300,000 for 2 consecutive years between you and your partner, whether that's your husband or your wife, and you expect to earn that income the following year, or you have a $1 million net worth, excluding your primary residence, where that can't be counted towards that. So that's going to be your accredited. Then you have your non-accredited, which is folks like myself that don't earn that income or don't have that net worth. So the reasoning I mentioned that is because a lot of deals, probably about 90% of the deals I come across, are open to accredited only. And that's important. And it's a distinction because if you're accredited, it means you can go out there and you can promote the deal on the podcast. If you're non-accredited, you can't solicit. Folks have to find you. So there's that little difference where, per just the SEC regulations, I couldn't, if I have a non-accredited deal, I can't go out and start marketing myself to investors. I mean, I can talk about what I did, but not the deal specific, because you obviously don't want to get in trouble. I would imagine it probably wouldn't be fun with the SEC breathing down your neck, which is why most people are accredited and have accredited deals. That way they can promote it and they don't have to worry so much about those regulations.
Fascinating. So, somebody who is going to hire you, what does it look like from start to finish in order to find those LPs to invest in their deal?
Yeah, I would say really it depends like who's your target audience. Like some folks really only work with doctors and they make that's their entire brand. Some people only work with sales professionals and that's what they make their entire brand. And then you have your engineers, your high income earners. So it depends who's your target audience. Like I remember one time I was talking to a client and I said, "Do you want to target doctors?" And he said, "No, I don't enjoy working with doctors." Where we got other clients and they do like working with doctors. So you want to figure out like who's your typical investor. More often than not, it's those folks that I mentioned before. And then from there, just building out the strategy from there to figure out, okay, we want to go after these types of shows. And then from there, it's putting like together like a nice pitch for you. It's getting a nice professional one sheet. And a one sheet is basically, if you could think when you're applying for jobs, it's almost like that as a resume. But instead, it'll go over like your bio. It'll go over potential topics you'd talk about, potential questions a host may ask you. So you want to make sure you have that done. And then really it's just reaching out to the host, seeing if they want to have you on. And that's why I mean being strategic, because there's so many podcasts out there and you want to make sure, okay, if I'm going on this podcast, does it even make sense for me to go on it? Or am I just sending a blanket pitch to every single real estate podcast, whether they're a real estate investing podcast or whether they are targeting real estate agent podcasts? There's a ton of, if you just type in real estate on iTunes, there's going to be hundreds of podcasts out there. So you want to make sure you're targeting the right ones. And then I'd say the really the big aspect of it comes on the back end, where you can go on, you can talk on podcasts, but are you sending people to a website? Does the website look professional? Is there somewhere where you could capture that potential individual, whether it's a lead magnet or they could book a call through your website? That's just a big aspect of it. And then, I mean, you can go even further. Do you have an email funnel set up? Do you have different things like that, different tactics for different touch points? But more often than not, if you're going on these shows, you just want to make sure you have a nice professional website look up, because a lot of times most people aren't ready to invest 50K with you right off the bat, but maybe they sign up for your investor portal, then they get on your email list. And then are you sending out emails? It doesn't have to be like once a week. Are you sending out emails once a month with updates on the deals or new offerings, different things like that? So I find that podcasting is almost like one part of it, but you want to make sure you have the other things on the back end, because podcasts can drive people to your website, but if your website doesn't look great or it loads very slow or you don't have any of those things that I mentioned, it's just going to be a little bit harder to drive those leads for you.
Have you ever come across a deal where you were just like, this is a dud?
Yeah, I would say quite a few. I mean, in my experience, in my experience as a passive investor, I would say
Sure.
there's been quite a few deals, and the reason I say that is before I even started investing, I think I talked to 25 to 30 different sponsors, and I was underwriting deals myself, and I could just look at the deals, and be like, okay, you're overpaying, or your capex is
Hmm.
too small, or let's say you're expecting to be 5% vacant, where I'm expecting you to be 10% vacant or 15% vacant, or depending on the type of market where let's say you're going in and you're doing a value add deal, and
Sure.
let's say your rent right now is 1,000 and the competitor is $1,050, and you expect to raise rents $1,200 or to $1,200, and then you're still a class B property and the class A's are going for $1,200. Different things like that where you're like, where are you getting these numbers from? And not to harp on multifamily, but I see it a lot in multifamily. I find that it's easy to manipulate the IRR more than
Yeah.
anything else. And for the audience out there, that's your internal rate of return. That's going to be your overall return over the lifetime of the real estate investment. So that could be 5 years. So maybe first year I get 6%, 7%, 8%, 9%. And then year five, the property gets sold and I get 25%. So whatever the IRR comes out to all that math, that's what it looks like, but you can tweak those numbers depending on, like I mentioned before, how much are the expenses, what does the vacancy look like, what is the projected rent growth, different things like that. But yeah, I know I've definitely come across, I would say it's more so the operator, I would say, than the deal itself. And I find for
Sure.
me, when I'm doing the passive investing, I want to make sure I like the jockey. You can think of it like, horses. And I'd rather bet on the jockey and then make sure the deal is good. Not to say I don't look at the deal at all. But yeah, no, I've come across quite a bit in all asset classes, to be honest. And I think it was easy a couple of years ago to make a ton of money, but now it's just become harder given the interest rate environment. People sometimes want top dollar for their deals that they're selling, and they missed the boat 2 or 3 years ago. So there's a lot of variables going on right now where I do find that some people are still putting out some duds for deals.
It's so interesting. I The concept of smudging numbers and raising money and potentially going upside down on a deal is so backwards to me, right?
Hmm.
Like, if you want to syndicate deals, you probably want to actually underpromise and overperform so that you can do it again with your investors, as opposed to overpromise and underperform, which we saw a lot of bad actors come up. It was kind of like, um, we can get real niche. Into some, commercial real estate Twitter. Um, the butt end of all the jokes in commercial real estate Twitter in 2022 were these syndicators buying multifamily properties at low interest rates who are now underwater. And it's like, I just can never understand the concept of fooling your investors on the front end, raising money. And maybe these GPs think that actually it is a good deal. Maybe their not intentions aren't, they're not ill intended, but I just think it's fascinating as a syndicator myself. Um, Under promise, over perform, as opposed to the opposite.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. And even looking at the deals, I don't know if it was ego or they just thought the market was going to go up continuously over time. But looking back now, I mean, you could look at the deals 80% LTV, so loan to value, where the real estate investor is doing 80% leverage, only 20% down. You have your variable rates, and they just expected that the rates were going to stay low. They didn't have a rate cap, or they just decided not to purchase a rate cap because they didn't want to spend that money. And then again, it goes back to those numbers. They over projected rent growth. Maybe they were in a market like Austin, Texas, where rent growth has gone the opposite way, where they expected it to increase. Where how could you really expect rent growth to increase like 30% every single year? That's just not going to be sustainable. So it was different things like that that I'm sure you've seen and I've seen in the real estate space of why some of these operators went underwater. And looking now, it's like, wow, like that makes a ton of sense. But we also didn't realize how quickly interest rates were gonna grow.
So, how do you track your KPIs when podcasting with investors?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest thing is going back to either having that lead magnet or having someone book a call with your company, because there's two ways you could go about it. You can create a landing page for every single interview that you do, and you can make it easy. And I don't want to make it sound that hard, but you could duplicate it for each interview that you've done. And I've had some clients want to do that, and then other clients, the way that I structure it is, let's say they have a lead magnet, they put in how did you hear about us section, or they know, in the sense where it's a little bit trickier when it comes to podcasts. And the reason I say that is because, like Google ads, you could just put a tracking you could just put a tracking tag on your website, so you know exactly where the individual came from. Podcasts are a little bit different, so I say the best way to look at it is the day that the interview goes live. And more often than not, if you have a good podcast host, they're going to let you know when that interview has gone live. You'll either get an email from the host or their assistant, and they'll let you know, hey, the interview has gone live. And then that's where you can go on, check your website. Did you get additional email signups that day? Did you get more booked calls that day? Not to say that's exactly why you got more calls, but usually it's a good correlation. If you're getting one booked call a day and then now you have 5 booked calls and your podcast interview went live, well, there's a pretty good reasoning behind that. But you just want to make sure, again, you have some sort of lead magnet set up or somewhere on your website where someone can book a call. Usually I like the lead magnet because, again, most people aren't ready to invest 50K with you or 100K or even 25K. Usually they want to hear from you a little bit more often, which is where it's nice having that lead magnet. Like for our company, you go on our website, it'll pop up within like 5 seconds. I can't remember what it was, but it's something about like the the best reason to go on podcast, something like that. I had it built over a year ago. I can't even remember now, but we get like 5 to 10 signups a week from it, and then you just nurture those relationships over time. And then we do get people book calls directly from that, and it usually comes, honestly, like after the 5th or 6th email that we've sent them. So we've had 5 or 6 weeks of having nice touch points with them. So it's not something that's gonna happen right away. I mean, maybe if you want like the Joe Rogan podcast and they had millions of down or millions of people listening, yeah, it could happen. But more often than not, it's going to be nurturing the relationships that you're building.
Let me ask you, how does timing work out with this? Because if I'm raising, if I'm under contract and I have 60 or 90 days, how do you line up the podcast to make sure that everything is cohesive time-wise?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the bigger challenges I find within the podcasting space. So I think there's
Sure.
one or two ways to go about it. It would be one, if you know you're going to be going under contract, you want to try to go book yourself on podcasts beforehand. And the reason I say that is most podcasts, they might be booking a week or two out from when they send you over their booking link. And then from there, it could be, let's say on average, 4 to 6 weeks for the interview to go live. So you're looking at 5 to 8 weeks. So if you're looking at 8 weeks, you're looking at about 60 days. So let's say 56 days, but let's say 60 days. So 2 months out. If you have to raise for this property and you only have 60 days, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. So like what I say for our clients is when I'm talking to them, how long is the raise for? Is it a 6 month raise? Is it just an open-ended fund? Is it maybe a private debt fund where you're always taking on capital? Or do you need to raise this capital in the next 60 days? Because if you're going to be doing that, usually it's just not a fit within the podcasting space. I would recommend going on and doing Google ads, just because I could reach out to the podcast host and say, hey, could you get this episode out a little earlier? They might oblige by it, or no, I've already done 10 other interviews that are going to be going live before you go live, and it's really out of your control, where Google ads are going to give you a little bit more, obviously give you more control over it. But if you do have more of a longer runway, then podcasts are perfectly fine. And again, usually about 5 to 8 weeks I find is the runway. Occasionally, like, I'll book myself on a podcast and they'll be booking out like 8 months, 12 months in advance, but that's usually not the norm. Usually it's about 1 to 3 weeks, and then about 4 to 6 weeks until that episode goes live.
Interesting. Yeah, that's something that we're finding. We're my podcasting calendar. I think the soonest you can get on the book right now is in January, and
Mm.
you know, but we're all learning. We're all trying to figure it out. So, um, Trevor, what makes you happy with what you do in
Yeah, I
commercial
would
real estate?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is just working with investors that are super smart but very bad at marketing themselves. And I think that's just like the coolest thing. I just come across so many cool businesses. Like even if we're talking outside of real estate in the oil and gas space, we worked with an individual where they're raising money to buy coffee there was like some sort of coffee company in, I believe, Colombia, where super cool what they're doing, but they're very bad at just marketing themselves. So I find it's very interesting, or working with these different companies. Maybe they have a tax abatement, or they're doing workforce housing, and they're doing a really good job for the community, but they're just have no idea how to promote themselves, how to promote their company. So I think that's what makes me happy, is just being able to help these individuals get more traction for their company, where they probably couldn't have done it on their own, or they just don't even know where to begin with it.
Any advice for a podcaster like myself?
Yeah, I would say just be consistent. Just keep at it. That's really the that's the biggest thing. I think it's a crazy statistic. It's I know you're not part of the statistic, but it's like 90% of podcasts stop after the 10th episode. So if you are a podcast host, know that it could take quite a while for you to start to see results from you going out there and producing your show. So that's why you just have to be consistent at it. Whether you're producing an episode a week, an episode every other week, or weekly, or daily, that would be pretty nuts doing a daily episode. But if you're just doing weekly, just make sure that you're consistent. If you're doing it on Mondays, always post on Monday at the same time. If you can help it, that's just going to build that consistency with your audience. And I find that's just the biggest thing over the long term to building that relationship.
Truly, you called it a relationship. I am literally in a relationship with my podcast. It's exactly what you said. It is a lifelong commitment. I'm a year and a half into posting every single week, and it is a labor of love, but it's really rewarding, and it's brought me to a lot. I've learned a lot from a lot of people. It's connected me to a lot of people, and I can attest to the results of it. So, speaking of connecting people, Trevor, where can the audience find you, follow you, listen to you? How can they connect with you?
Yeah, most certainly. So they can go to our website, podcastingyou.com, and they'll have the lead magnet and the call that I mentioned throughout the interview. That's just podcastingyou.com, or they connect with me on LinkedIn under my name, Trevor Oldham. Always happy to chat with people there as well. If they have questions, whether about podcasting or whether they're thinking about being a passive investor, happy to talk with folks on either side. Or if you are a podcast host and a passive investor, happy to chat as well.
Trevor, thank you so much for being on Commercial Real Estate Secrets. And for those of you listening, we'll see you next week. Thank you for tuning in to Commercial Real Estate Secrets. If you have found our podcast to be valuable, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review on your favorite streaming platforms, and make sure to follow us on social media at Aviva Real Estate. For brokerage services or to get in touch with us, head over to thewarehousehotline.com and submit a contact form. My name is Aviva. This is Commercial Real Estate Secrets. We'll see you next week.